All right, well, welcome everyone tonight. It's a real pleasure to have you, and I'm very, very excited about this. We have a tremendously special guest joining us. For those who don't know me, my name's Darren Morton. I'm the Director of the Lifestyle Medicine and Health Research Centre here at Avondale. And this presentation is actually part of a unit which looks at lifestyle medicine for specific populations. That is the lecturer for this unit is Dr. Paul Rankin. But I'll be introducing our guests in just a moment. Before I do, I just want to say, really by way of acknowledgement of country, and I think it's very, very appropriate that we have this tonight, even though that we're on an online format. You know, it's quite remarkable to me that lifestyle medicine in many ways is about the application of old precepts for present problems, really. Because if we look back to, throughout history, a lot of the way, particularly Indigenous cultures lived their life was very, very aligned with the tenets of lifestyle medicine. And in fact, many of the things that we do in lifestyle medicine is trying to help people to return to the ways of living that we used to in the past. And what's quite intriguing to me is that in fact, we have a whole lot to thank the Indigenous communities for their contribution to lifestyle medicine. And I'm thinking particularly, and Paul will often reflect on this. I remember being at one of the presentations. This was probably over 10 years ago now. I imagine Paul at a conference where Karen O'Day, Professor Karen O'Day,
yes, was
the first. She stood up and she said, "Hey, you do know that type 2 diabetes is reversible, don't you?" And it was we'd seen cases through programs like CHIP where people had reversed their type 2 diabetes as best as we can understand. They'd normalised their blood sugar levels. Were no longer taking any medications. But I remember this presentation, Paul and I were sitting next to each other, and Karen O'Day says this, and everyone was sort of like, oh, shock, horror, like, you can't say that. You can't say that a progressive degenerative disease like that is reversible. And of course, more recently, in 2019, the Lancet published a paper which says that this actually should be a realistic goal that we go after now for people with type 2 diabetes. But Karen O'Day cited the work that she'd done back in the early 80s, where she'd worked with Indigenous populations, and indeed she'd taken a group of Aboriginal ladies back to their natural ways of living. Out west, and what she found is these Aboriginal ladies who had diabetes were actually able to reverse their conditions. And so I think we have a tremendous heritage there. We have so much to learn from our Indigenous brothers and sisters. And so it's a very special event that we have with us tonight, Professor Bob Morgan. I want to tell you just a little bit about Bob. First of all, I would like to say, now, am I pronouncing this correct, Bob? Is it Yama?
Yama.
So Yama Bob. Professor Morgan is, now I want to get this correct too, a Gamaroi? Gamaroi. Oh, yes. My eyesight's getting really bad. Gamaroi man from Walgett, Western Australia, out in New South Wales. And look, it's not overstating to say that he is a highly respected and acknowledged Aboriginal educator and researcher. And he's worked extensively throughout Australia and internationally in the field of Aboriginal knowledge and learning. And he's been involved in this space for over 40 years now. His involvement and experience with Aboriginal education and training has shaped and influenced by his many years of senior leadership at the state, national and international levels of Aboriginal education policy and program development. Professor Morgan is currently the chair of the board of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, Education and Research, and he also is a conjoint professor with the University of Newcastle. I noticed in some of the email exchanges I had with Bob, he had a quote at the bottom, which is a quote that's actually comes from his work, and I want to read this to you because I think it really does encapsulate the spirit and the heart with which he goes about his work. And it says this, it says, for those of us who are committed to change and transformation, we must never allow our roles to be reduced to a salary or a duty statement.
Yeah.
It must always be viewed as a conviction for righting wrongs and the creation of a more just, equitable and civil society. And I think it's just really powerful words. So, Bob, we just want to say that it's a tremendous honour for us to have you tonight and to be hearing from you. I've heard Bob present at several of the lifestyle medicine, particularly the Australasian Society of Lifestyle Medicine conferences. And in fact, I was actually fortunate enough to be the MC for at the last conference where he presented. And he spoke about spirituality and the role of spiritual identity in this space too, which I thought was just very, very powerful. And it was really lovely to hear someone bringing that sentiment to it, because it speaks to the deeper aspects of who we really are. So Bob, it's a great pleasure to have you tonight. We're really looking forward to hearing what you have to share. And I'll hand it over to you. And we will have time for questions at the end too. So thanks so much for joining us, Professor Morgan.
Thank you, Darren. And just to be clear, I guess we've got till 8 o'clock. Is that right? Okay. Yeah. And well, thank you for the invitation to come and share with you and the students about some of my thoughts around what I refer to as cultural wellness as a prerequisite for positive and sustainable health. I too would like to start by acknowledging the traditional lands upon which we are gathered and its people. And I pay respect to all those who have fought for our rights and freedoms as Indigenous people. May their efforts never be in vain. I especially acknowledge those who struggle with profound dignity and unwavering resolve as they strive to correct historical wrongs and resolve contemporary realities. Ultimately, I wish to pay homage to all the warriors, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal, who continue to challenge the ongoing oppression and marginalisation of Aboriginal peoples. They demonstrate that we should never be silent in the face of injustice. Bear with me, because as I say, I'm not completely 100%, so I'll have to reach my water every now and again, but we'll get through this. And I've got my doctor's number on hand just in case something happens. To create what I refer to as cultural credentialing, I just want to share with you some of my personal background. I'm the youngest son of Eric and Edith Morgan. I'm a Gummeroy man from the Western Plains of New South Wales. I'm also a father and a great-grandfather, a grandfather and a great-grandfather. One daughter, 3 grandchildren, 2 great-grandchildren. And I'm at an age now where I never ever thought I'd get to, but, and I was told when I was growing up that because of my illness, I would never make it past 50. But I've gone past my use-by date, and here we are. So I'm an educator, and I've worked in Aboriginal education for over 45 years. I've been privileged to work alongside some of the best minds on the planet, but none have been as important nor instructive as my mother, who, although totally illiterate, possessed a profound and infinite wisdom. I've served as an Education Commissioner with the now defunct New South Wales Education Commission, and I spent 6 years as a board member for the New South Wales Anti-Discrimination Board. I've served on numerous national committees and have chaired numerous community organisations, something which I am still committed to, but my engagement now is limited because I want to make room for the next generation to come through. And so that's part of my work now that I'm doing with schools out west and in other places. I also chair the World Indigenous Peoples Conference on Education, a conference that comes together every 3 years, except of course during COVID. And our next conference, which usually attracts between 3,000 and 5,000 people, delegates from across the world, will be in Adelaide next November. It was supposed to be last year when COVID hit, so we've had to postpone that. And health and other matters that impact the learning of Indigenous people is always interrogated at these types of conferences. As Darren has shared, I chair the Board of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Education and Research at the University of Newcastle. And as I said, I was elected to the position of chair of the WIPSI, and that was confirmed in Toronto, Canada, a couple of years ago. And my term will expire at the next conference, which is due for Adelaide next year. So I've been very privileged to be able to connect with those types of issues and across the globe. I've been privileged. I grew up on the riverbanks of Walgett. I spent the first 15 years of my life living in a shanty and humping, and I'll touch a little bit more on that later. But that was one of the consequences and one of the factors which have led to my illness that I've suffered with for years and years and years, the bronchiectasis, apart from type 2 diabetes and a range of other things. But as I understand it, I'm not a clinician, but as I understand it from what I've been told by some of the doctors I've worked with over the years, that those extreme living conditions when I was very young contributed to the development of bronchiectasis and other bronchial issues that I suffer with. So these are some of the salient issues that I'll touch on during the next half an hour or so. I want to touch on cultural credentialing, and Darren, you did a bit of that. And the use of the word Yama is a universal way of showing that people are culturally aware and practicing in a culturally safe manner. Just a simple word that's used and acknowledged by most Aboriginal nations across the country is a really good method of connecting and demonstrating that it's respectful, that it's reciprocal. So I would say that if you have the opportunity to do what Darren did tonight, just using the word Yama is a great door opener and a great way of saying to people, yes, we see you and we understand you, and let's now talk. And essentially, that's what Yama means. So I've done my cultural credentialing stuff by talking about my country and my mother, my family. And whenever we go to various Indigenous nations and Indigenous communities, this is also always a critical point of how we connect with each other. Quite often, people make the mistake that of thinking that when we talk about country, we're actually talking about geography. But no, we're not. We're talking about country, which is essentially what defines our relationship with land and with each other. So it's never about geography. So I want to share with you some of the some things that research is telling us, both in Australia and internationally, and share with you some of the lessons from afar. I'll touch on what has been emerging in Indigenous health in particular, and in other quarters as well, but the old concept of mal, and I'll define these later, and spiritual fatigue. I'll also touch on the notion of shared medical appointments, which I believe are fundamental to improving the life experience and health status of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in this country. I'm totally convinced that shared medical appointments is the way that we should embrace, the way that we engage with Indigenous communities. We're not having the type of engagement that we would all like at the moment, because we all know that change is something that people really push back. It's a form of sort of collective cognitive dissonance that even in the face of evidence, people will still be wedded to a pre-existing truth. So, but I'm convinced that shared medical appointments will be embraced by the community, our community in particular, and that it will start to transform the way that we not only do health business, but life business. So, and that will happen. I have no doubt about that. So that leads me then on to the next point, and that was about lifestyle medicine. And of course, Darren stole a little bit of my thunder earlier by saying that I've always believed that, and why I was attracted to lifestyle medicine, is that Indigenous people were probably practicing lifestyle medicine for thousands and thousands of years, never knowing or even caring that this is lifestyle medicine. But we can see across the world, in places like Canada, in North America, in New Zealand, Hawaii, even in Japan and some other countries where Indigenous people still exist, that there was a form of medicine that was fundamentally couched around how we lived our lives. I'll then move on to talk briefly about taking control. And what does that mean for Indigenous Australians, but for all of us? And then I'll conclude by sharing some remarks. So this is what we're seeing as far as the research that's been conducted across the world. And increasingly research is telling us what we as Aboriginal people have always known, that it is only when we are in control of our own lives do we witness a real shift in the socio-political circumstances that defines our life journey, including health. Currently in Australia, there are 3 sites where research is being conducted that is exploring what a new model of community governance might look like. This goes beyond the old question of self-determination or self-management and a range of other government-inspired policy approaches, which have all failed, including, might I add, the closing the gap agenda. I think the government have fundamentally failed in the way in which it is structured and conducted the strategy. And it's only now that they realise that Aboriginal people, Torres Strait Islander people, are fundamental to that type of change if the strategy is going to work. But that comes after, of course, millions and millions and millions of dollars have been spent, and failure has been the chief characteristic of that journey. So in New South Wales, there are in Australia, there were 3 communities that are currently funded by the Australian Research Council to conduct research around a new governance model and what that might look like for Aboriginal people. So these 3 communities are the Gunditjmara people in Victoria, the Nungirri Nation in South Australia, and groups and individuals from the Wiradjuri Nation here in New South Wales. Still early days, but some of the earlier findings have been really, really encouraging. The research that's been conducted is based on a project that originated out of Harvard University some 15 years ago. It's called the Harvard Project, actually. And project researchers have worked with Indian communities in the US to explore new models of Indigenous Indian governance and economic development. And the research in the project tells us some important lessons. The first is that sovereignty matters. When Aboriginal nations make their own decisions about what development approaches to take, they consistently outperform external decision makers on matters as diverse as governmental reform, natural resource management, economic development, healthcare, and social service provision. We've known that all our lives. We've never been in a position, though, to exercise the rights and privileges that go and responsibilities that go with being the first Australians. We've always been the recipients of other people's largesse, whether it's policy or whether it's funding or whatever it may be. And we're the only colonised country on the planet where a form of treaty has never been negotiated between the people that came to our country and the first Australians. There was one attempt at a treaty which was unofficial in Victoria, I think 1840s or something like that, with John Bateman, I think his name was. But that was quickly discarded and was not officially recognised by the government or the colonial forces of the day. So those types of things need to be considered front and centre if we are seriously going to address the issues around health and education and economic development and just life. Those things are still not, in my opinion, being addressed in a responsible and sustainable way. So these are, like I say, the things for some of the lessons that we've learned from the Harvard project. And I've been lucky enough to attend some of the Harvard project training with Professor Manly Begay, the Indian arm of the research, and Professor John Connell. I've been thoroughly impressed with their findings. And I believe it has great relevance to what we're doing in Australia, or what we could do in Australia. So institutions matter. For development to take hold, capable institutions of governance must back the assertions of sovereignty. Nations do this as they adopt stable decision-making rules, establish fair and independent mechanisms for dispute resolution, and separate politics from day-to-day business and program management. This is a really important one because on Friday I attended a community forum back in my hometown of Walgett, and that was about the current crisis state of the school. And the kids aren't being engaged, and everyone and the policy around education is all framed around the notion of disadvantage. But fundamentally, what we see in these type of circumstances is not a question of disadvantage, but a question of disengagement. Kids are just not being engaged in the learning process. And most people that live in the community are sick and tired of the waking up every 3 or 4 months and there's the Walgett schools community, being talked about in the media. And the department keeps on abrogating its responsibility, I would argue. And their approaches tend to be around, well, let's build some more buildings. And so they don't look at the epistemology or the pedagogy of what's missing in places like Walgett. They tend to think that, well, pour a bit of money in there and build a few more buildings, then people will be happy. That's just a fundamentally flawed approach. And culture matters. Successful economies stand on the shoulders of legitimate, culturally grounded institutions of self-government. Indigenous societies are diverse. Each nation must equip itself with a governing structure, economic system, policies and procedures that fits its own contemporary culture. Leadership matters. Nation building requires leaders to introduce new knowledge and experience, challenges assumptions and propose change. Such leaders, whether they're elected, community or spiritual, convince people that things can be different and inspire them to take action. So what can we do about the current state of health disparities that continue to confine Aboriginal people, Torres Strait Islander people, to the margins of society? There are a number of things, I believe, some of those that I've already mentioned. But if long overdue and sustainable change is to occur, a new model of Aboriginal healthcare must be adopted. A model that empowers local communities and one that embraces the principles emerging from the nation building research that I've referred to. For instance, I believe that the PHNs in New South Wales and their equivalent bodies in other health jurisdiction must work with local communities to negotiate an Aboriginal health and wellbeing accord, one that is underpinned by a set of clearly defined and community-endorsed strategies to implement, monitor, and continuously evaluate progress against agreed local targets. This is important because there's a tendency of government, and including health, to homogenise Indigenous realities. And there is no such thing as an homogenous Aboriginal reality. There are many different cultures, many different languages, many different realities. So the issue around context is really, really critical. And so that needs to be factored into the way that we develop health and other public policy. I'll now just briefly touch on mal and spiritual fatigue. So Aboriginal peoples continue to suffer critical chronic health issues, many of which I argue can be directly linked to historical and traumatic policies and programs, and what I refer to as the contamination of Aboriginal cultures. So in terms of mal, which is essentially meaninglessness, alienation, and a loss of culture and purpose, Professor Gary Egger, affectionately known as the father of lifestyle medicine in Australia, and I initially developed the concept of mal when we were working with Aboriginal men in the community of Walgett. We were doing a project for the local Aboriginal Medical Service. And so the number of men that we interviewed and that we had dialogue with over time, it became clear that there was something missing. Aboriginal men weren't using the medical service. They weren't engaging with health providers. We wanted to know why. And the research showed that the men had a sense of alienation, a loss of culture and purpose. And so there was no meaning that they had in their lives. The downturn of labour market, shifting from the shearing industry, agriculture and other things where they became more mechanised, meant that a lot of Aboriginal men, and non-Aboriginal men too for that matter, lost employment. And that's not going to change anytime soon. So that's what we discovered in Walgett. And Gary and I wrote that up and in the report form and made a series of recommendations. Mal aligns with the concept of logotherapy developed by Frankl and the concept of salutogenesis developed by Antonovsky. The logotherapy, of course, is around the notion of purpose. And Frankl's seminal book, Man's Search for Meaning, which describes the way that he was able to survive the concentration camps that he was interned in during the Second World War. And the concept of salutogenesis developed by Antonovsky was fundamentally focused on resilience. What makes people resilient when they're faced with great trauma? And all those things are present in the lives of Aboriginal people. So I'm very, very taken with the old notion of logotherapy and salutogenesis. And I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from that. I'll now just share with you my concept of spiritual fatigue. I've mentioned already that we've spent most of our lives, I guess, as Aboriginal people, either struggling and demanding change. Probably 80% of our lives is spent on this. We spend the rest of our time defending it. Rarely is there any place where we can actually celebrate what it means to be human, let alone what it means to be Indigenous. So I define spiritual fatigue as emanating from a political and social process that requires an individual or group of individuals to constantly struggle for human rights and freedoms, and the unrelenting need to incessantly defend them. There's no room for celebration in this paradigm. Therefore, purpose and meaning are absent, evasive, or severely threatened. So I'd like to leave a little bit of time so that we can have a bit of dialogue. So I might go on to my closing remarks. So, I believe there is no one-size-fits-all remedy or solution to address health inequalities and other long denied Aboriginal rights and freedoms. And as I've mentioned already, spiritual fatigue, a determinant of spiritual fatigue is Aboriginal people feel about, how Aboriginal people feel about the plethora of research reports, academic articles and government inquiries that have been conducted, particularly during the past 50 years. But still, we struggle to achieve genuine and long-lasting change and transformation. I deal with spiritual fatigue by remaining a prisoner of hope, because ultimately, goodness overcomes evil, I believe. The denial of our rights and freedoms is an evil, because at its core, it is as destructive to the human spirit as any other evil. And it's something that can no longer be tolerated. More and more, we are seeing Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people across the country demanding a change to the way in which governments and their instrumentalities engage with Indigenous people. The concept of cultural safety, of course, emerged in New Zealand, developed by the Maori, particularly Maori nurses. And it's something that we're still searching and trying to define how we might work with that in Australia. I'm not sure what it is in terms of Australia, but whether it's the old notion of the fact that we are so far removed from other countries and other realities. The fact that the political system, as I understand, as I think of it anyway, I think the assault on democracy as it was originally conceived and practiced in the 1400s and others, and Aboriginal societies had a form of democracy, of course, well before the Greeks invented it. But it's not important to argue who discovered what first. I think it's more important to focus on how do we change and how do we create the type of society that we can all embrace and feel comfortable with. And what's our legacy? What do we want to leave for those that follow? And it's an interesting conversation that I have with teachers. I ask them what their legacy, what is the legacy they'd like to leave in the communities that they are currently engaged with. And quite often, most of them really haven't even thought about their legacy. It's just seen as a job for a year or two, less quite often, and then people will move on to the next appointment. But something more than that is needed. So in the end, if change and transformation is going to occur, and if we're truly, honestly on about change and transformation, then we must ask ourselves, if not us, who, and if not now, when. So I think I might just leave it in that. I'm mindful that we've only got another 20 minutes or so. There's a couple of other slides that I wanted to share, but I think in the interest of time, I think I might leave it at that, and I'd welcome any questions and points of clarification or whatever.
So much for that, Bob. Ton of things, ton of questions I'd love to ask here. Look, I'll give the opportunity to the group first. Is anyone, feel free to, we've got about 20 online, so it shouldn't be too chaotic. If you would like to ask a question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask that.
Yeah, Professor Morgan, if I can, I'd like to ask a question. I haven't done a lot of work in the Aboriginal Indigenous population, but I have done a lot of work in the Pacific Islands. Mm. And one of the things I discovered very early on the Pacific Islands is that Pacific Islanders, particularly the Polynesian, have quite a different concept of health from what I had as a European. Mm-hmm. For me, health is jumping out of bed in the morning and feeling good and feeling fit and feeling active, no pain absent, actually. Whereas in the Pacific Islands, health is about being able to meet your obligations to your family, your community, and your church. And it wasn't until I discovered that there was this different concept of health within the Polynesian community, that I was actually able to be effective there. How would you define the concept of health within the Aboriginal population or within an Aboriginal culture?
Very similar, Paul. And as I mentioned, that I think that one of the manifestations of the failure of existing health systems to engage more appropriately and in a culturally safe way with Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander people is that old notion of mal, that people right. They've lost, we've lost the fundamental human right to be involved in the type of things you described about the Pacific nations, how they construct and engage with health. Well, I think that was always a part of, or something similar to that, has always been a part of the Indigenous reality, the Indigenous experience across the world. It's only when colonisation impacted our realities, when we started to see things change. And Australia, like I said, is one of the very few countries, if not the only country, where colonisation existed that doesn't have a treaty.
Yeah.
So we're still trying to negotiate ways around getting the government to at least listen to the voices, and that's partly what the Uluru Statement and other things are about. But that was all conveniently sort of nosedived because nipped in the bud, because people were introducing then these concepts of the third chamber and other sort of furphies that took away from the essential message that the Uluru Statement raises. So I'm glad you mentioned that notion about the Pacific Islands. I see similar things happening in other Indigenous contexts, particularly when their rights and freedoms are underpinned by instruments such as treaties. They're in a much more powerful position to deal with the politics, but also deal with the culture that has been there since time immemorial. And when you've got the resources to be able to sustain culture, because as we all know, culture is something, it's a learned behavior. It's not something that we're all born with, born with our heritage, of course, but with culture, it's a learned behavior. So when you start to chip away at the cultural sort of notions of what defines Indigenous people and others, then we start to get into problems. So I guess the need in Australia is for us to develop public health policies around the recognition that we're talking about fundamental human rights and freedoms. It's not just about the treatment of an illness. It's much more profound than that. What we don't do too well. We're still struggling in many respects. Still struggling.
Well, there's
thank you.
A few questions in the chat box, and I'll just read them out. The first one is, early in your presentation, you spoke about 3 studies that are going on within Indigenous communities. And they were just wondering about how those experiments are going and whether they've been conducted in a collaborative way with the Indigenous community. Absolutely,
absolutely. Full collaboration. In fact, most of the primary chief researchers, investigators are all Indigenous people. People like Professor Larissa Berendt from UTS, and there's about 3 or maybe 4 universities that are actively involved. I think it's Flinders University, Monash University, and UTS in New South Wales. And they're collaborating with Harvard University. I'm not totally aware of where the projects are up to, but I think they're into their 2nd year, maybe their 3rd year of research. And I think it was a 3-year research grant. So I'm hoping that some evidence will emerge from the project later this year.
The question from Taryn. So many of the audience here are healthcare professionals, and just wondering from a very pragmatic point of view, how can healthcare professionals communicate better with Indigenous people, when assessing and working with them to affect best health outcomes?
Yeah, It's interesting, Darren. I think that one of the things I would advise is not to be afraid, not to think that a question that you want to ask is going to be silly. It's how you ask the question, how you frame it, that could cause embarrassment. And that's what we mean by cultural safety. All those things around cultural safety and the lessons from cultural safety, if you're able to read some of the literature around cultural safety, and that will provide some of the answers to that particular question. There are some things that some of the one of the clinics that we've been working with at in Blacktown in Sydney, this is Gary and John and I, we're doing some work there around pre-diabetes. And that clinic has decided to take the advice about creating an elders corner. So, and once or 2 days a week, local elders are just employed just to sit in the corner, and that might sound bad, but just to be present. So if people, Aboriginal people in particular, but anyone wanted to come and chat to them about the things that they're feeling scared about, then that's a way of breaking down some of those barriers. I think everyone is scared about, and some people don't want to know about what the doctor might tell them. And one of the worst things that we found in some of the research we did is that people didn't want to know. They'd rather just remain ignorant about what's happening to them than actually go to seek advice, medical advice. So having an elder, having some type of measure that's identifiable in clinics and practices could be just a simple flag of the Aboriginal nations or other things that tells people this is a culturally safe place.
Matthew asks, when it comes to lifestyle medicine, how much of it is a government problem and what can be done at a community level to effectively begin change amongst our Aboriginal brothers and sisters towards better health?
Yeah, good question. I'm not a big fan of government. I think that government are the major problem that we're faced with, because I worry that democracy has become privatized, and it's the money that then drives the way in which we frame democracy and how we deliver on democratic principles. And so I'm not a big fan of government in this sense. I understand the need for democracy and I support the old principle of democracy. But I think it's the privatisation of democracy that's become problematic. And not just in Australia, but indeed across the world. You only had to look at what happened in the United States just to get an understanding of how that type of works in that particular context. So, but that doesn't mean that I'm not hopeful. It doesn't mean that I don't embrace the principles of democracy and the way in which we can, all societies can live to share the bounties of a just and equitable world. But neoliberalism, with all of its pains, is something that I also reject. I don't know whether you noticed a couple of last year, the last Q&A episode, when they had an ex-politician on the panel, and the moderator asked if he was willing to take the jab when it became available. And his immediate answer was yes, but it was a qualified yes. And his qualification was that it needed to be shown that it was effective. And then his other qualifier was that it can't be free, that people should be paying for the jab. And I just thought, and this is an ex-politician, bloke by the name of Yapsley from New South Wales. And that indicated to me that we've got a hell of a problem when that type of mentality is elected into representative democracies like the governments we have in Australia.
I've got a couple of questions, one from Tracy and Isaac. And Isaac's actually a general practitioner out Alice Springs.
No,
So very involved in that space. So, and they're both asking about the shared medical appointments, whether you can elaborate a bit more on some of the benefits of those and where they're being used.
Okay. Well, I first came across shared medical appointments when Gary Egger and I and Dr. Andrew Binns, who's working as a GP up in Lismore, and we were working with some men, Aboriginal men in Lismore. And the fundamental practice of shared medical appointments is that you have 10 to 12 people who gather together, who a facilitator who's trained will work with the individuals prior to the doctor actually coming and consulting. So the facilitator is trained to conduct an interview, have a discussion, have a dialogue with all the patients around something that might be a common illness. It could be diabetes, could be obesity, could be alcoholism, could be whatever. And the one up in Lismore was that we started off with 15 men, and they didn't. It wasn't a program shared medical appointment, which is where you've got a common illness. This is a general one where anyone could turn up with anything, and they all did. And I'll never forget one experience with a young man, probably 22-year-old, an Aboriginal bloke, who turned up at the shared medical appointment and never said anything. But I wasn't facilitating, John Stevens was. And we went around the circle and we asked people what they wanted to see the doctor about and what would they like to share in the circle about their health concerns. Well, the young bloke didn't say anything until we'd concluded the consultation. And then the doctor came in, Andrew came in. And by the time we went around the circle again, and the doctor had the opportunity to talk with each patient. It's all there, it's recorded, all the records, everything is kept as you would do if you were on a conventional one-on-one sort of consultation. And so Andrew spoke to each individual patient, and then it came to the young guy, and his uncle, who was also in the circle, really got angry and said, well, I'm sick of you talking to me about your concerns. This is your opportunity. And the young bloke felt safe in that environment because he had his uncle, he had his elders, he had other people in the circle. So the young bloke then shared with Andrew that he had a lump on the foot and he was a keen football player and all that type of stuff. And he thought he'd never play football again. And he thought that it was cancerous. And there was something, and someone told him that. And remember earlier, I said that a lot of people are afraid to go to the doctor because they don't want to really learn what's wrong. Well, he was one of them. Well, Andrew had a quick look at the young guy's foot and said, look, come to the clinic in another half an hour. I'll see you in half an hour and I'll cut that off and you'll be right. You'll be playing football again in another 3 to 4 weeks. And you could literally see this young guy. He had purpose again. He had meaning. But I believe that was one of the benefits of that shared medical appointment experience. He may not have had that in the same way in the conventional one-on-one. It may have, but I think it was more likely to occur in the shared medical appointment model.
Well, but it's been interesting for some of us, who've been involved in the lifestyle medicine community for some years, to watch what's happened globally. And obviously, globally, lifestyle medicine is really taking off, which is very exciting. But Australia has been very, very innovative in a number of ways, and thanks to the leadership of people like Gary Egger, as you mentioned. What I find really fascinating about the Australasian perspective on lifestyle medicine is this integration and this recognition of this reciprocal relationship between the health of people and the planet. That connect, and obviously the Indigenous communities always have this connection to the land. How encouraged are you to see, you know, the lifestyle medicine movement led by the likes of Gary Eger really embracing that perspective?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I've known Gary for over 50 years. And so I've been working on him for 50 years. And it's taken me that long for him to understand what I was banging on against when I was a young bloke, and he was a young bloke. But seriously, Gary is probably one of the most gifted thinkers that I've ever worked with. Fascinating mind. And so I've known Gary all that time. And when he and John and Andrew invited me to become involved with ASLM, I sit on ASLM's board, and not as a clinician. I keep telling them I'm not a clinician. I know nothing about the medical sort of clinical side of health, but I can talk to you as a patient and also as an educator to try to connect those type of dots. So, and I'm excited about what the board and what ASLM itself has been doing in the and has the potential to do in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health. We're in the process now of developing a particular Indigenous strategy for lifestyle medicine and Indigenous communities. And over time, I think this time next year we'll have a series of strategic sort of plans for how we might shift this a little bit further. There's been a reluctance, even from within our community, my community, to engage, because most people have been scared off by the department, the bureaucracies about whether it meets the codes from from government and other things. And but I think that we're starting to see some shift.
Second to last question. I know you've done well. You've hung in there well, brother. Matthew just asked another question. In terms of being culturally sensitive, is there something that perhaps practitioners should be aware of when dealing with Aboriginal brothers and sisters?
Yeah, I think it's all about context. I mean, I don't think I can say, or anyone else can say, if you did X, Y, Z, then that's the answer. And I think that's simplistic as well. I think the other thing to do is to try to understand the type of context that people are living in, not just the cultural context, but the socio-political context is also important. I mentioned earlier the notion of the language, the iconography that can be used within clinics. We did some research with and a project with the Hunter New England Central Coast PHN a couple of years ago, and we conducted a cultural audit for them. Now, on their webpage, this is the Central Coast Hunter New England PHN, you can find the cultural audit and the recommended actions that came from the research that we conducted. So if you're really interested, I'd strongly recommend to have a look at their website, and because it's all downloadable as well. But the stuff there is that it can be applied in various contexts across the country, in fact. But we were confined to the Hunter, New England and Central Coast.
Last question, and I was going to ask it by asking, what would be your hope? What would you like us all to learn, to recapture from the ancient wisdom of Indigenous communities? I was going to ask it that way, but I'm going to perhaps ask the same question, I think, in a different way. Okay. You started this presentation by saying how such high regard you held your mum in, and that you said that you, of all the the brilliant minds that you've come across in your time, and Gary Eger being one of them, it was your mum that's actually that you learnt the most from, and the wisdom from her. What is that takeaway? What would you would love to share with us from that perspective?
That's a really good question, Darren, and one that I can't quickly find an answer to, other than to say that I think that in most communities, most Indigenous communities, there are people that are heroes, that are usually the unsung heroes of the community, that do amazing work. It's not always the CEO, the local land council, or the other people that are in paid employment that are really the movers and shakers in community. It's those quiet achievers that need to be sought out and a relationship developed with them. Now, they exist, as I say, in every community. And quite often, they are the women of the community. Most Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, the power base is with women. It's always been with women. And we know that, and we're socialised that from an early age. So some of those relationships, though, have been contaminated over time. Some of the infrastructure that gave the capacity for us to deal with those type of things have been removed. But the good thing is that we're starting to rebuild them. I've taken Gary and other people that I work with Aslan on cultural camps back onto my country, and we've sat with the what's called the Gully Gurina Council. These are mainly men. Women have got their own business, and it's only next month in April where the men and the women will convene and talk about what we're concerned about, and more importantly, how we might start to address them. So I think if ever you get a chance, and I've been talking with Gary and John and Stephen and others about conducting cultural eduventures, so that we take people onto country and get people to understand and connect in a very, very important sort of way beyond the old notion of health, but how do we connect as human beings? And what is this notion of country, and how does it manifest, and what's the lesson from that we can then take into our practices in other places? And so that's one of the strategies that I'm hoping to help develop with Aslan over time. I'm not sure whether I answered your question, Darren, but
no, I figured that wouldn't be a short answer. But yeah, hey, you know what, Bob, I just want to really thank you. Our time's up, and we want to be respectful of that. But just want to thank you so much for your wisdom and your work and the contribution legacy that you're leaving. This is certainly, you know, something that needs so much attention, and having voices like yours is just, you know, just so powerful, and we're really, really privileged and blessed to have you sharing with us tonight. So thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Aaron, and thanks to everyone for showing the interest. Good luck with your studies. So we need culturally grounded and informed practitioners out there in the world to help make the world a better place. So good luck with what you're doing. And hopefully next time that we chat, I might be in a better frame of mind, and maybe it'll be well post shingles. Please, if anyone never get it, some of you may have already had it, but let me tell you, it's worse than any other pain I've ever experienced in my life. But I'm still kicking.